Welcome to College Money Methods walkthrough of the 2026-27 FAFSA. I'm Paul Martin, and I'm the director of College Money Method, and I'm excited to show you each step of the FAFSA, first starting with the student experience, then continue on to the parent experience. There's a lot to cover, so let's get started. To get started with the FAFSA, it'll be the student who first logs in using their FSA ID in order to complete their section of the FAFSA and invite their parent contributor to log in and later submit their information. Now, if you have questions about how to create an FSA ID, you can use the link at the top of the video to go to an article with details on how to create an FSA ID, including video instruction. So the student will log in, and then we can see the student is going to start their new FAFSA form. Once you log in, you choose student, and there are several introductory screens which provides information on how to complete the FAFSA. You can choose to watch these videos or move on to the application itself. So the student information, the identity information, will carry through from what they've entered on their FSA ID when they created their FSA ID. And if there need to be changes to this information, student would go to account setting to make these changes. If the student also entered their mailing address while creating the FSA ID, it'll show up here. If not, they can easily enter this information to hit continue. Now it'll ask the student what state they're a resident of. It'll default to the state in their permanent address. And then it asks what date the student became a resident of that state. If the student was born in the state and hasn't moved, they could choose their month and year of birth or choose the month and year that they moved to the state. Now, every contributor to the FAFSA going forward has to provide permission for the IRS to share any tax information that's available for purposes of completing the FAFSA. And that's even the case when an individual contributor, like a student, may not file taxes in a given year. Now, as you'll see here, it would be the 2024 tax return information that'll be used for 26-27 FAFSA. And because of this, if a student didn't file a tax return in 2024, they still have to provide consent to share this information. So as we scroll down, we'll see that the student would approve consent to share information, and then it would securely transfer any information about the student's tax return from the IRS. And again, if the IRS has no information, it's going to share with FAFSA that there's no information on file, but that's still considered a valid connection to the IRS. Now the student can hit continue and enter more information about their personal circumstances. All of the questions under personal circumstances will relate to how and if a student is determined to be independent. For purposes of filing the FAFSA, they wouldn't require their parent information to complete the FAFSA, or whether they're considered dependent and therefore need to invite their parent contributor. So we'll move forward. Student marital status is the first question. Again, this is not the student's parents' marital status, but the student itself. The next screen asks about the student's college grade level when they begin college in 26-27. It's important to note that regardless of however many college credits a student may have earned in high school, they are going to choose first-year freshmen because they are graduating in the spring. And then there's an additional question as to whether it's their first bachelor's degree. Now, these are the personal circumstances. If any of these circumstances are checked, that would allow a student to complete the FAFSA as an independent student and not require their parent information. We could see if the student is currently or was in the armed forces, whether they had their own children, that would qualify them to be able to complete the FAFSA as an independent. If any time since they turned 13, whether they're an orphan, ward of the court, or in foster care, if they're a legally emancipated minor. And then finally, if the student is under legal guardianship from somebody other than their parent, and this has to be determined by the court. It's important to note that while a student may be under custodianship of an individual other than their parent, if it's not an actual legal guardianship, they cannot choose this option, and they would choose none of these apply. There's a question about whether a student is homeless or at risk of being homeless after July 1st, 2025. And then now there is an additional screen asking a student whether there is a risk for them to contact their parents for the purpose of completing the FAFSA. And if there is a risk due to certain circumstances like abusive home, abandoned or estranged parents, other factors like a parent being incarcerated, then they can choose yes. And if they choose yes, they're considered provisionally independent for purposes of completing the FAFSA, which means that they don't invite a parent to contribute, but they are not considered fully independent until this information is verified by the financial aid office at which the student is applying for financial aid. So this provisional student independent status needs to be verified by financial aid before the student is actually given full independent status, which will require documentation and a student to be contacted by that financial aid office. In this case, we're going to choose no. This means that Raya is considered a dependent student, and in order to receive full federal aid options as well as potential college financial aid options, she would need to invite a parent to complete the form and include the parent information. Now, there is an option for a student to complete the form as an independent student if they only want to be considered for an unsubsidized loan. Students should choose no, that they want full financial aid options to get all federal aid options, state aid options, and college financial aid options. Now, there are questions about student demographic. First question is about the student's sex. This is a required question. The next questions are optional and used for research purposes. This would include a student's race and ethnicity. So a student can choose that option. And then there's a question about student citizenship status. Students can apply for federal aid if they're a U.S. citizen or national, or if they have certain eligible non-citizenship status. And you could see what those statuses are based on the current FAFSA requirements. I'm going to choose that Raya is a U.S. citizen, and then it asks about parent educational status. So what's the highest level of attainment in college for Raya's parents? There's a question about whether a parent was killed in the line of duty, because if a student does have a parent that was unfortunately lost in the line of duty, the student would be eligible for the Pell Grant. And now we're talking about high school completion status. So you'll choose completing high school diploma. And on the next screen is where you will locate the school which you are currently attending for purposes of submitting this information for financial aid. Now, this is a very limited database given that it's a demo, but there are all the schools listed for students to choose from ones who are using the actual live FAFSA. Now we move on to student financial information. And what we'll see on the next screen is actually that it's asking for student tax return information. This is a very limited demo, meaning that it's going to show all possible questions a student might get in the case that they filed a tax return in 2024. However, if a student did not file a tax return in 2024, it'll simply ask the student whether they were required to file. If they say no, then the student would move on to report student assets. So in order to move on to the next screen, I'm going to have to choose zeros for these. Again, student would not see these questions if they are a non-filer for 2024. Now, student assets that are expected to be reporting are anything as of the date of filing in checking and savings accounts, any current net worth of student investments. Typically, students may have something like a brokerage account that they might be investing in, or they might be the beneficiary of a trust or a UTMA or UGMA account. Any of those types of investments a student is required to report. What would not be reported here is a student's 529 plan. Student 529 plans, while they're the beneficiary of those 529 or college savings plans, are always going to be reported as a parent asset unless that plan is owned outside of the family by, let's say, a grandparent or other generous relative. Then it's not reported anywhere on the FAFSA. But a student 529 plan or college savings plan is never reported as a student asset. And then finally, net worth of business or farm, assuming a student may have a small business, they would have to have greater than 100 full-time employees to have to report anything. This is the selection screen where a student would choose the colleges they want to send the FAFSA to. The FAFSA does not automatically go to every college. Students have to select colleges to receive the FAFSA. And it's important to know that if a student's applying for state aid options, most states require the state institutions or the institutions within that state in which they're applying for state aid to be listed first. So in this case, I'm going to choose New York as my first option. And here, this is a very limited database as mentioned, but we can select college like Barnard. As mentioned, this database isn't accurate. Barnard College is not in California. We can go back and search for other colleges in other states. So in this case, we can choose a state such as Massachusetts and search for colleges that would typically be in Massachusetts, like Northeastern University. Now, I listed the schools. We can see the selected schools here. We can see here that I listed a school that would be in New York first, because as mentioned earlier, New York residents, if they're applying for state aid as well, need to list the state colleges that they would want to have the federal form sent to. Now, finally, before the student exits the form, they're asked to invite their parent contributor. And in order to understand which parent they should invite, it really will depend on the marital status of the biological or adoptive parent of a student. If a student's parents are married, then they're going to invite one of those married parents to the form. Later on, we'll see that depending on the filing status or the tax filing status of married parents in 2024, maybe only one parent has to contribute to the FAFSA, or that parent who's been invited might have to invite an additional parent to the FAFSA. If students' parents are not married, they might be never married, separated, or divorced, and they no longer live together, then the student would only invite one parent, and the FAFSA rules on that parent contributor to the form is the parent who provided the greater financial support for the 12 months prior to completing the application. If it happens that both parents contribute absolutely equally, FAFSA asks that it's the parent with the greater income and assets that is added. And finally, if a parent who's divorced or never married to the student's biological parent is remarried, then the step-parent information would be included as well. That will happen on the parent side, which we'll discuss when we go through the parent walkthrough. So the new form makes it a lot easier because all the student has to do is type their parent's email address, and they don't have to now include the parent's legal name, social security number, or birth date, which was the prior requirements. And this will send the invite to that email address. And the invite will have a special code that will be used for that parent, and that parent will use that to connect their information to the student's primary FAFSA. The student can also write down this code or copy the link and share it on text however they want. That will allow also the parent to complete the FAFSA on behalf of the student. Now we can see we're at the end of this process for the student. We've gone through personal identifiers, personal circumstances, demographics, student financials in colleges, and then finally the contributor who the student has invited to complete the FAFSA, that parent. When we hit continue, the last part of this application is for the student to sign and submit this. This signature happens electronically and they're agreeing to the terms of the FAFSA, and then they'll land up on the pending submission page. The pending submission page lists the parent who's been invited to complete the FAFSA and also allows a student to go to other parts of federal aid if they need to. But at this point, the student is finished with their section, and we'll move on to the parent sections that need to be completed, starting with the parent contributor invite. So now Raya's mother, Alcina, has received an email from the Department of Education asking for Alcina to participate in Raya's FAFSA form, complete the parent sections in order for Raya to be eligible for financial aid. And we can see here the email now includes the specific code that ties the parent information to the student's FAFSA. But simply by clicking accept the invite, it will lead Alcina or the parent to the federal form. Again, you would have to already have a FSA ID to log in to submit your information. Once we log in here, we can see that if we've linked to this through the email, it will automatically put the invitation code in here. If you have the invitation code separately from your student, you can double check that code. You can overwrite this information, but this is what's going to tie your information to the student's FAFSA. You accept and agree to share information with the federal government for purposes of student federal aid. And similarly to the student, there are several introductory screens that will give you information on how to complete the FAFSA and what to expect from the process. Now, the first screen is the parent identity information. Again, this is information that came from the parent's FSA ID when they created their FSA ID, including date of birth, social security number, email address, and phone number, and the mailing address associated with that ID. Again, if this is blank, you can fill that out at this point. Just like the student contributor, a parent is required to provide consent to the IRS to share any tax information from 2024 that's on file. This is true even if a parent hasn't yet filed their taxes or is not required to file taxes in the US for any purposes. This is a required component of the FAFSA now for a student to be eligible for aid. And if a parent declines this information, we can see that the student will not be eligible for federal aid purposes. So we're going to approve this. It's also important to note that if it turns out to be the case that a parent is not filing taxes in the US, there will be a way for them to manually enter information. So this is transferring information, confirming that that transfer is successful. Now there are questions about parent demographics. So this is information about the parent. What's the parent's current marital status? Single, never married, unmarried but still living together. This would require, even when parents don't file taxes together, for both parents to submit information because they live together. Married, remarried, separated, divorced, or widowed. So I'm going to choose married in this case. The state of resident for the parent, might assume, is similar to that for the student. So this would be the date the parent became a legal resident of that state. Parent finances. So we're already in the financials part. The first question is around federal benefits received. So there are several federal benefits that can qualify students and parents for a more simplified FAFSA. You can see the list here. And if you can qualify for any of these, so that if any member of the household receive one of these federal benefits for any time period during 24-25, you would check one of these options. I'm going to choose none of these apply, move on. Here we can see there's a question about family size. So automatically what's transferred on your tax return are the number of individuals on your tax return, which include potentially the parent and the parent's spouse, if the parent is married filing jointly, as well as the dependents claimed on that tax return. Now, there may be reasons why the family size that is actually living in a household may be different than is on the tax return. And so it's important to have your tax return and confirm that the number on the tax return reflects your family size, because if it does not, then you have the option to actually manually enter your family size. So because this parent, Alcina, said she was married, it's assumed there's already going to be 3 in the family, which is parent 1, the spouse, and the student. And this is where we can enter other children or dependents within the family. So maybe we have 2 additional children. We want to confirm that. We can see the family size is 5. One thing to note is, going forward, whenever a parent chooses their family size is different than what's reported on the tax return, financial aid office will reach out to the student in order to verify the family size, since it's different than that which was reported on the tax return. If in fact your tax return does match your actual family size, you can choose no and move on to the next question. There is still question on the number in college within the family. Should not include parents, but any dependents who are in college at the same time. This does not any longer have any impact on eligibility, but is more information that's passed to the college so that they're aware of the number in college. And then we can see information about the parent tax return. So these are supplemental questions that you may receive if it's relevant given the tax return that's been transferred. So we can see here there's a IRA rollover, a pension rollover. If you had a rollover from one retirement account to another in 2024, it's important to put that number here at this point. This is because it would be counted as income, which can reduce a student's eligibility because it's assumed that there was money taken out of retirement and used within the family versus rolled over into another account. And our current tax return has limitations. It is not able to show that to the FAFSA. So any amount that might be in a rollover for 2024, you would want to enter here, depending on the type of rollover, whether it's a IRA rollover to one IRA or pension rollover to an IRA. Amount of college grants, scholarships, and AmeriCorps benefits received by the parent. This is typically 0, and this question wouldn't show up unless there was a specific question asked based on the tax form, and then any foreign income income exclusion. Now here is where parents report assets, and I highly recommend that you follow the link on this video so you can calculate how to accurately report assets on the FAFSA and the CSS profile if you're completing that supplemental form. But here was where child support received would be included, and this is total child support received for all children by an X, not just that student applicant, in the last complete calendar year. Parent assets include current balances in checking and savings accounts at the time of reporting. And we can see here current net worth of investments. This would never include your primary home or any investments that are in qualified accounts or retirement accounts. But here are the types of investments that would be included as part of this application. They would be any 529 or college savings plans that would benefit the student. If it's owned by a parent or student, brokerage accounts, any trust this family's a beneficiary of, annuities, and equity value in second properties. All of those investments would be included, rolled up. And again, you can use the calculator that's available on the link at the top of your screen to be able to calculate the accurate amount to put here. Now, this year's FAFSA has changed rules back for parents who are business owners. You are only required to report any net worth of a business if your business is greater than 100 full-time employees. That's true for farms as well. If not, then you report 0 here if you have fewer than 100 full-time employees. Now, it may be the case if you don't file married filing jointly and you're a married individual that you would have to invite spouse to the FAFSA form. And this screen may or may not show up depending on your tax filing status. If you're interested on more information on who has to complete the FAFSA based on marriage and tax filing status, please follow the link at the top of the screen here. But in this case, it's assumed that Alcina and her husband and Raya's dad file taxes married filing separate versus married filing jointly. If parents file married filing jointly, there is no need to invite an additional parent or spouse. But in this case, this demo is assuming that the additional parent files a separate tax return, so they need to also be invited to Raya's FAFSA to complete information because the tax return that's been transferred by Alcina does not have the father's information included. And again, there's a unique code that Travis will receive that links any information Travis, the father, is completing it on his FAFSA form to Raya's FAFSA. So we're already done with the parent section. We can see personal identifiers here. We can review any of the information and go back and correct those by clicking on any of these links. And then finally, we can see in the case that a parent has to invite an additional parent, that invitation has been sent. All that's left now is for Alcina, the parent, to sign electronically, agree to terms of FAFSA, and submit the application. And then there's a confirmation screen that there's a pending submission of this information. Once all contributors have completed their parts of the FAFSA form, a student, Raya in this case, can log in using their federal student aid ID and navigate to the FAFSA submission summary. The FAFSA submission summary is essentially a roll-up of all the information submitted by all contributors. So it is important to know that students can see parent information that's been submitted on the FAFSA. But it also reviews the eligibility that a student has, in this case, Raya, for federal student aid programs. So these are the estimates. These are only estimates. Final determination is made in the financial aid offer of what might be available to a student from federal aid. As you can see here also, at the bottom of the FAFSA submission summary is where student parent can find the student aid index. The student aid index is that number that's submitted to a college, which is approximately the family contribution or ability to pay. And based on the student aid index and the cost of attendance at various colleges, it may result in additional eligibility for financial aid from the institutions. Again, here's where we can see all the answers that have been submitted, both in terms of student sections as well as parent sections. And if a student needed to make a correction, they can make a correction here. If a parent needs to make a correction, they actually have to fix any information that may be related to their submission by logging in through their FSA ID and making corrections that way. This is also the school information that a student has submitted their FAFSA to and any potential next steps. One other thing to note is that if a student does need to add additional colleges later or remove colleges and add colleges because they're applying to more than 20 colleges, this is the step at which they would do this. And they would technically be making a correction. However, there wouldn't be correcting the FAFSA, but updating the FAFSA with new information. I hope this demo and walkthrough was helpful. If you have any questions, please reach out to college counseling for more support.